Welcome to the Family Milk Cow podcast, where in every episode I cover topics that equip you with the skills and know-how to look after your girls in the barn. Family milk cows are more than just livestock. They are a part of our families. They deserve the best care possible from knowledgeable and responsible owners. So pull up a chair or your milk stool and let's dive into another episode of the Family Milk Cow podcast. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Family Milk Cow podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Wolf. I am so glad to have you here for the last episode of the first season of the podcast. This first season is just a little mini one, only 6 episodes, and it's incredible. We're already here at the end, and we've got a great episode today where we are going to be talking about A2A2 milk, what it means, and what you should know. But before we dive into that, I want to give you a quick podcast update. So as I said, this is the last episode of the first season, but I have a whole lot more in store for you in the coming weeks, months, and hopefully years of the podcast. So after this episode comes out, what you can expect is sometime in December, I'll have a fun little bonus episode coming out. And then in January and February, I will be recording seasons 2 and 3 of the podcast. And you can expect to see season 2 coming out over the course of April, May, and June of 2025. There'll be a little break there in the summer when I'm losing my mind trying to keep up with everything else between the blog, YouTube channel, and of course a podcast. And oh yeah, my kids and house and everything else. And then season 3 will be coming out in the fall of 2025, September, October, November. And then I will be peppering bonus episodes as well as the Milk House Minute, which is just kind of a fun little bonus, pretty loosey-goosey, just update on what's going on with my own cow, my own little homestead that is available to our Patreon subscribers. That all being said, if you are interested in being a guest for season 2 or 3, so if you want to get in on being a guest anytime in 2025, please reach out, head over to familymilkcowpodcast.com to fill out the guest form. You're also welcome to email me at kelsey@roughandtumblefarmhouse.com if you have someone you'd like to suggest or nominate for a guest. I would love to talk with some other homesteaders, veterinarians, small business people, cheese makers, just general milk sellers, you name it. I would love to chat with folks here on the podcast. So even if you have no podcasting experience, but you think you've got a great story to tell or some good information you'd love to share, I would absolutely love to hear from you. So let's dive in on this episode to A2A2. Now, you probably are aware of this already, and if you aren't, this should be a pretty thorough, hopefully, introduction sort of A2A2 101. Our cow's milk is made up of a lot of proteins. Beta-casein makes up about 30% of all milk proteins, and the variations of that you're going to see are A1A1, A2A2, or A1A2. Interestingly enough, in the research I did for this, I discovered that cows are the only mammal that actually has a variation of this sort of protein. Every other mammal, who of course produces milk, that's a qualifier for being a mammal, only produces A2A2. So it's sort of a fascinating thing that they think was kind of some sort of genetic mutation that happened along the line of domesticating dairy cattle, that we have this kind of different variation of that protein in existence. This is genetic. And you can test cows for it. You can test via their milk, you can test via their blood, or you can also do a tissue sample where you're taking some of their hair maybe, or sending in a little snip of tissue from their ear and having it tested. We'll get into why people are looking at A2A2 and some of the possible benefits of it in a minute. Why do we even care, right? But I do want to cover really quick as well how you can get an A2A2 animal. So we'll talk about testing in a little bit. Once you've tested your animal and you know what you're dealing with in terms of their genes when it comes to the specific protein, you might want to be selecting to breed for just A2A2 in the future. So just kind of how this works combination-wise, if you breed an A2A2 animal to an A1A2 animal, you have a 50% chance of getting an A2A2 calf. If you have both parents, both your cow and your bull are A2A2, it's 100% you are going to get an A2A2 calf. If, say, your cow is A1A1 and your bull is A2A2, you are 100% going to get an A1A2 animal. So the only way to for sure get an A2A2 calf is to breed 2 A2A2 parents. We should turn this into a drinking game. Every time I say A2A2, you take a swig of whatever. But anyway, to get back to that, if you have an A1A2 and an A2A2, then it's a 50-50 shot. So those are the only ways you are going to be able to have that protein variation is those combinations. Now let's talk health benefits of A2A2, why it's even a hot topic, why we're even discussing this on the podcast. To put it in a very simple nutshell, it is believed that it is easier to digest this milk, even if you are lactose intolerant, that some folks can handle this type of milk, the A2A2 only milk. I did a bunch of research for this episode, making sure I knew what I was talking about properly, and I'm going to have a lot of links in the show notes for this episode. Head over to familymilkcowpodcast.com if you're interested in finding the show notes and links to reading more, because a very informative, but boy, is it a bulky one, study that I read or paper that I read is called A2 Milk, New Perspectives for Food Technology and Human Health. It's from August 9th of 2022, and it was published by the National Library of Medicine. Now, as I was saying, he's thick. It's bulky. There's a lot to get through, and I worked through absolutely as much as I possibly could. But I think to make it the easiest to understand, what I'm going to read for you now is the conclusion of this, because it really, I think, sums up everything you're going to find in all your research about A2A2, if it's really helpful or not. In general, the positive results obtained in experimental animal trials concerning the health effects of A2 milk have not always been confirmed by clinical trials in humans. However, there seems to be sufficient consensus on the beneficial effects of A2 milk on the reduction of digestive intolerance associated with the consumption of A1 milk. This positive effect is of great importance since a good part of the consumers who have abandoned milk consumption have done so because conventional milk causes them discomfort. Combined with the fact that some consumers are willing to pay a higher price for A2 milk, A2 milk could help to alleviate the current economic difficulties suffered by both milk producers and the dairy industry. To this end, information campaigns would be necessary since in some countries the level of awareness of the potential benefits of A2 milk consumption among consumers still seems to be low. For the rest of the potential positive effects on human health, despite the contradictory results to date, there have not been enough clinical trials carried out for the conclusions obtained to be definitive, and it would be very interesting to deepen the research in this sense. Basically, if you look at the research about A2A2, there is not a ton of research out there that is conclusive. However, the research that is out there and that has been done in other countries, as concluded by this paper, shows that humans with milk intolerance issues are much more able to process and handle those proteins in A2A2 milk. One thing that should be noted that was also discussed in this paper is that A2A2 milk does seem to have less of a coagulant property to it, which would mean that it might not be quite as good in terms of cheese making. However, that being said, of course, this is an anecdotal thing, not a study. A local cheesemaker, they use all A2A2 and they've got really good cheese. So again, that's not a big study. That's just what I've experienced. But that is basically the only potential negative that was listed in that paper, and I honestly haven't even seen that mentioned anywhere else. But in terms of good academic resources on this, most of them are going to tell you more studies need to be done. Let's talk now about the future of A2A2 and sort of my experience with it and what you might expect to see. As part of doing the research for this, I checked out a video that had Chuck Sattler, who at the time it was a year-old video, so I'm not sure if he's still currently in this position, but he was at that time the vice president of genetic programs for Select Sires. Select Sires is a company that provides semen and also has folks that kind of work in a region. We use a Select Sires rep. He comes and does our AI, our artificial insemination for our cow. So this is a guy who he really knows about genetics when it comes to cattle. And so he shared some really interesting information about how the bulls that they source and offer have changed a lot in terms of A2A2. So this is for Holsteins, and I typically don't pay attention to Holsteins. My girls are registered jerseys, and so that's what I look at in the sire book, which I will say, looking through there, you would be hard pressed. There's maybe a handful that are not A2A2 jerseys at this point. And that also may have something to do with the fact that you will find a higher prevalence of A2A2 in some breeds. Holstein tends to be kind of on the bottom of that. You're going to find it more in your Jersey, Guernsey, Normandy, Brown Swiss. You'll see a lot more of it there, but it is definitely still fairly prevalent in Holsteins as well. Back to Chuck Sattler and his Holstein numbers. In 2015, of all the Holstein bulls they had, 33% were A2A2. 5 years later, in 2020, that number jumped up to 56%. And 3 years later, that number jumped to 70% of the bulls they had on offer were A2A2. So in the course of just 8 years, it more than doubled. And now it's just about 3/4 of everything they offer is A2A2. So that being said, I personally always prioritize making sure that I am breeding to an A2A2 bull, because from what I have seen on the market, pretty much everybody wants A2A2 right now. People will pay a lot more for A2A2 in terms of milk. You can typically charge a higher price. You also are able to sell your animal for a lot more if they are A2A2. Here where I live, you see usually a minimum $2,000 for an A2A2, even a heifer that's, maybe bred but not in milk yet. However, I do think that being the standard that we're kind of coming into, that you probably only have a few years where you're going to be able to charge a premium for that, because from the way things are looking, it's going to be much easier. And that's kind of what people are just going to expect, is that you're getting A2A2. So maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years down the line, it'll be hard to find something that isn't like that. So I wouldn't necessarily put all my eggs in the basket of thinking, I'm going to make all this money because we'll have A2A2. Well, pretty soon it's going to be you and everybody else that also has A2A2. So that's something just kind of to keep in mind. And going back to Chuck from Select Sires, he also was talking about how, even though, like I said, from that study conclusion I read to you, well, the scientific research isn't necessarily there yet, that at Select Sires, that is what they saw the demand was. And so that is how they changed what they had on offer to meet the market. The last thing we need to cover is how to find out if your animals are A2A2. From what I can find online, there are basically 2 places where you would go to have your cow checked for this. The first option is you can send a test to UC Davis. It costs $40. To do it, you pull out either from sort of the pole of your cow or from the base of their switch. You need to pull out 20 to 30 hairs, and you can't just cut them. You really got to pull them out because you need to have that kind of root bulb still attached to it. So I think if I ever decide to do this, I'm probably going to go from the head and not the tail, because I would really feel like getting a swift kick. You basically tape them into a piece of paper, mail it off, and you can expect to get your results in 2 weeks. Another option for testing is Central Star also does testing. They have 2 different labs in the state. I know one is in Michigan, and I forgot to look where the other one is. They can test for A2A2 either in blood, so a blood sample, milk, or you can send a tissue sample where you are taking a little bit of a snip of tissue out of your cow's ear and sending that in. One thing to pay attention to is if you are going to send in a milk sample, they are 94% accurate versus it is 99% accurate if you are doing blood or tissue, which is also what UC Davis would be considered as well, sending in the actual, tissue attached to the cow's hairs for testing. That might be something you want to consider in terms of accuracy if you are comfortable with that 6% chance that maybe it isn't accurate. And that's something to keep in mind as well. If you're buying an animal and they say they are A2A2, you might want to ask what sort of testing they did, if they did tissue, blood, or milk. It is a little bit cheaper to go through Central Star. It is going to cost you $23.75. The test itself, I think, is $13.75, and then there's a $10 lab fee or something like that. And then you have to cover shipping, and especially if you're doing a milk sample, you'd probably want to pay for the slightly nicer shipping. So I kind of estimated that out as costing around $30. So it's a difference of $10. And they say you can get your results in 10 days from the date of receiving it. So if you figure too, it takes a few days to get there, depending on where you live. The turnaround time is about the same for both. All right, that is what I have for you in terms of A2A2. As I said in the title, no, it's not a droid from Star Wars. It's a protein in your milk you probably want to pay attention to as you look for what kind of sires you want as you begin to develop your herd. That's going to be all from me for now. Look again for just kind of a fun bonus episode sometime in December. Otherwise, I'm going to see you guys in the next year. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Family Milk Cow Podcast. You can become a part of the Family Milk Cow Podcast by joining the Milkmaid Brigade, sponsoring an episode, or following along on social media. You can find links for all these and more, including show notes, at familymilkcowpodcast.com. If you love what you're hearing, please rate, review, subscribe, and turn on those automatic downloads. One of the best ways to support this show is simply by sharing it. And as always, make sure to give your girl down in the barn a good scratch behind the ears from me.